Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening to you all. I welcome you again in the second lecture of the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies introductory course to the Palestinian issue. Israeli colonialism, the Palestinian issue, past, present, and future. In this lecture series, we will be discussing the historical background as well as the developments of the Palestinian issue. The first lecture focused on the past history of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian issue. And today we will be continuing our discussion with a deeper look into Zionism, the Nakba, as well as the modern Zionist state, the State of Israel. In the past discussion, we highlighted the ancient history of Palestine, mentioning that Palestine is at the crossroads of ancient civilizations, having been the crossroads between the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian civilizations. Palestine, or the land of Canaan, has endured several occupations and conquests throughout past history. It was conquered by the Assyrians, Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Romans, all the way until the Islamic conquest. And for more than 13 centuries, different Islamic dynasties, starting with the Rashidun, conquered Palestine. The Palestinian people, who are the direct descendants of the many Canaanite tribes that lived in the land of Canaan or in Palestine, continued to live in this region for thousands of years. Now, in our previous discussion, we highlighted how several peoples identified or were later identified as Canaanites, including Jebusites, Edomites, Ammonites, Israelites, the Philistines, and many other nations. They mixed, they coexisted, they fought at times, but they all formed what we call the Canaanite civilization, the first recorded civilization in this region called Palestine. Eventually, since the Roman time, the region of Canaan, the land of Canaan, adopted the name that was advanced earlier by Greek historian Herodotus, the name of Palestine. The name was based on one of the nations that lived in this land of Canaan, the Philistines, who lived around the coastal area near Gaza, Asdod, Asqalan, and other southern coastal areas of Palestine. And ever since the Roman time until today, the region continues to be called Palestine, except, of course, for the most recent part of history when the Israeli occupation started since 1948 until today. In today's lecture, we will highlight Zionism, the movement, its ideology, its leaders, and how it plotted together with the imperialist European powers of the 19th and 20th century to take over the land of Palestine and establish a Jewish national home in the land of Palestine. We will also discuss what happened in Nakba, or catastrophe, the years of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. We will also discuss the growth and aggressive role of the state of Israel that was established ever since. Of course, we're discussing all of these developments with the backdrop of an ongoing genocide or ethnic cleansing happening right now in Gaza. So our prayers go to our people in Gaza and in the rest of Palestine, hoping that this ongoing genocide will come to an end and a free Palestine will come soon. So moving on with our discussion today, we will highlight Zionism, Nakba, and the state of Israel. In future lectures and discussions, we will look into other aspects of the Palestinian issue, including, of course, the Palestinian struggle, the resistance, the political parties and system in Palestine, the different major issues in the Palestinian issue, and the geopolitics of the Palestinian issue today. However, in today's lecture, we will focus on these three interrelated topics, and I hope that you will give your full attention, because these different but interrelated topics could have been illustrated over three different lectures, but we would like to have them all in one discussion because of the connections between them. If we talk about the Zionist movement, we have to go back to Europe. So what I mentioned in our previous lecture about the Palestinian issue and the Zionist occupation being the byproduct of a European rivalry is still a very important, relevant point. The Zionist movement started in Europe because of European problems with the Jewish populations of Europe. And this, of course, brings us to a quick discussion of the Jewish faith and Judaism. Some people, until today, still confuse Zionism with Judaism, although there are, of course, links. But these are two distinct terms for an overlapping group of people. So one can be a Jewish person but not identify with Zionism. And interestingly, one can be a Zionist person who is not necessarily a Jewish person. There are many Christians, especially evangelical Zionists, but of recent days, we started to see even Muslim Zionists and Arab Zionists. So Zionism is a political ideology, and the term itself is based on the writings of some European journalists. The first is probably Nathan Birnbaum, who in 1890, in his journal, described Zionism, Zionist, and political Zionism. Interestingly, this very person who coined the term Zionism has, in later stages of his life, became anti-Zionist. So Birnbaum has actually become an Orthodox Jew who found Zionism to be against his religious beliefs. But back then, when he coined the term, the Jewish people in Europe were facing serious problems. The term Zionism refers to the land of Palestine in one way or another, because the mountain of Zion, Jabal Sohyun, is actually a place that exists in Jerusalem way before Zionism was established as a political movement. So Jabal Sohyun, or Mount Zion, is actually a place, an actual place in the city of Jerusalem. Coming back to the Jewish people who were facing serious problems in Europe in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, the Jewish people are the followers of Judaism. Judaism is the monotheistic religion that was promoted by Prophet Moses. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all consider Moses to be a revered, respected prophet. The Jewish people like, of course, to claim that earlier prophets before Moses were also Jewish. So since the Israelites, one of the tribes that resided in the land of Canaan at one point of time, is a direct descendant of Prophet Israel or Prophet Jacob, the Jewish people who are descendants, or the early Jewish people who are descendants of Prophet Jacob and the Israelites, claim that all this family of prophets is a Jewish family. Prophet Abraham, his son Isaac, Ishaq, his grandson Yaqub or Jacob, the other children, Joseph, Yusuf, and others are seen by these Jewish proponents as Israelites and as Jewish prophets. But we're not going to debate this. Of course, the Islamic view is that these prophets were believers in one God. And since Islam is surrender to God, so all prophets are Muslim, but not followers of the Sharia of the Islamic rituals. They are followers of the Islamic Aqidah or Islamic creed in the belief of one God. Anyway, back to the Jewish version. The Jewish people are the followers of the Jewish faith. The commandments which were revealed to Prophet Moses were, of course, the earliest guiding principles, and eventually the followers of Prophet Moses, who came from Egypt to Palestine, were the early Jewish population and the early Jewish people. They did not follow the commandments of Prophet Moses, and eventually they got lost in Sinai. Their next generation followed Prophet Yusha bin Nun or Joshua to Palestine. Maybe the name Jew is from Prophet Joshua, or from Judah, who was one of the children of Jacob. Either way, the Jewish people, the early Jewish people, were the followers of Moses, Joshua, who came to Palestine, who clashed with other Canaanite tribes and took over rule of parts of Palestine for a few hundred years. Of course, their descendants included Prophet David and his son, Prophet Solomon, who became kings in Palestine and established a kingdom in Palestine. So for about 500, 600 years, there was some sort of Jewish political dominance in Palestine, which, of course, did not mean that other Canaanite tribes were not there. They were, of course, there. Other Semitic Canaanite tribes were in existence. They clashed with these Israelite tribes, or they probably formed alliances with them and continued to coexist for hundreds of years until the Jewish political rule was wiped out, first by the Babylonian Iraqis, later by the Romans. Now, having mentioned that, the Israelites were exiled from Palestine on several occasions, and the Jewish faith started to spread. So in Yemen, for instance, Tubba of Yemen, the king of Yemen, at one point of time forced his people to convert to Judaism. Those who did not follow were burned, and this is documented in Surah Al-Buruj in the Holy Quran. There were other Jewish new converts in Europe, for instance. Khazar tribes started to convert to Judaism, and many people in Eastern Europe started to convert to Judaism. Eventually, the numbers of Jewish followers of the Jewish faith from outside of the Semitic tribes and outside the Israelite tribes became way larger than the number of the actual descendants of Prophet Jacob and the Israelites, or the Bani Israel. There are today, in today's world, up to probably 15 million Jews. Maybe 90% of them or more are Ashkenaz Jews, or European Jews, Khazar Jews, who converted to Judaism probably in the 8th century, a few hundred years ago, and have no ethnic links whatsoever to the Israelites and Bani Israel. Interestingly, many of the descendants of Prophet Jacob, who are people of Canaan themselves, converted to Christianity or Islam. So if we do a DNA test for the people of Palestine, we will find that many of them actually have links to either one of the Canaanite tribes, including the Israelites, while the Israelis of today, the followers of modern day Zionist Judaism, are 90% Europeans with no links to the original Jewish tribes. So having highlighted this, it's important to note that the Jewish faith includes both Zionists and non-Zionists. In the late 19th century, the term Zionism was coined by Birnbaum, but was adopted as an ideology by several other lovers of this ideology, groups like Lovers of Zionism or Lovers of Zion, and other Jewish intellectuals and activists in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, realized that there was a lot of repression of the Jews in Europe, and there has to be a solution. So it was a Jewish problem in Europe, and the solution was for them to create a homeland somewhere else. Eventually, it was Palestine that was chosen. So Jewish emancipation came at the expense of the people of Palestine. The Zionist movement started to come to existence in the late 19th century. And the first Zionist Congress was organized in Switzerland, in Basel, in 1897. 1 year before that, Theodor Herzl promoted the idea of Zionism through a book called Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State. This small booklet highlights his dream of a Jewish emancipation and a homeland for the Jewish people somewhere, which eventually, became Palestine and turned into Israel. So the Jewish problem in Europe was, of course, persecution of the Jews. In Russia, for instance, there was something called the Russian pogroms, or the anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia, which started along the 19th century all the way until the early 20th century. Many Jews were killed or persecuted or exiled and controlled, of course, after the Russian Tsarist Russia controlled territories that had Jewish populations. Earlier, these Jewish people were living in peace and harmony under the Ottoman Empire in places like Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Poland, Crimea and other places. They lived for centuries in peace under the Ottoman rule, but when the Orthodox Christian Russia took over these territories, a problem with the Jews started to develop. Of course, in other parts of Europe, in Western Europe, in Southern Europe, Catholic and Protestant Europe, the Jewish people were also not happy. They had to be isolated into different communities and ghettos. And eventually, when Nazism was on the rise and fascism was on the rise in Europe, the Jewish people were persecuted in many European societies. So the solution for this persecution of the Jews, according to Jewish intellectuals, was either one of two options: to form a new Jewish state, Jewish emancipation, through the creation of a Jewish state, or to assimilate further in their own European societies. There were two ideas, and the proponents of both ideas actually tried their best. Eventually, the Zionist movement, which got more organized after the first Zionist Congress of 1897, became very influential through plots with European imperialist powers. Coming to this man, Theodor Herzl, who is an Austrian journalist himself, he liked the idea of Zionism. He adopted it. He started to work hard to achieve a Jewish state for the Jewish people. And he started correspondence and meetings with several European powers. But first, he started to reach out to the Ottomans, hoping that the Ottoman Empire will accommodate his goal. So he met the Prime Minister of the Ottoman Empire, Sadr al-Azam, and offered actually to pay the debts of the Ottoman Empire in return for Palestine. Of course, the idea of a Zionist state was still in its early embryo level, so it wasn't yet finalized fine idea of the state of Israel. It was only an idea to have the Jewish people live somewhere. Therefore, of course, there was confusion probably in Europe and elsewhere on how this Jewish state will be. That's why later on in the Balfour Declaration, it mentions a Jewish homeland, but it doesn't particularly mention a Zionist, independent, Jewish-only state. But anyway, coming back to Herzl's efforts, he tried again to meet the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire himself, and he offered to pay the debts of the Ottoman Empire in 1901, but Sultan Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Empire refused this offer. So Herzl realized that it's really hard to buy a homeland under the Ottoman Empire, and he started to reach out to German, British, and other European governments to lobby them for a place for the Jewish people. The British in particular, who are Protestant Christians, had actually the seeds of the idea of Israel or a Zionist or a Jewish state early on. In 1840, their Prime Minister Palmerston was actually thinking of having a buffer zone, a buffer state, an outsider state in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. If you remember in our previous lecture, even Napoleon Bonaparte, when he occupied Egypt and later parts of Palestine before being defeated in Akka, proposed actually a Jewish state in Palestine and called the Jewish people of the world to come to Palestine. But these were early calls. Eventually, the whole project was achieved through later European involvement, in particular the British one. 1904, Theodor Herzl dies before realizing his dream of a Jewish state, and Chaim Weizmann takes over. He was, by that time, a British chemical scientist who contributed to the science of chemistry and assumed the leadership of the World Zionist Organization. He was welcomed by the British. The British, who were at that time the main colonial power of the early 20th century, had their plots and plans unfolding. One was with the Zionist movement. They were talking to the Zionists, to Rothschild, to Chaim Weizmann, to other Zionist leaders. Another with the Arabs, who were revolting against the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century, especially Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the Prince of Mecca, who was promised an Arab caliphate in the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. In 1915 to 1916, there were correspondences between Sharif Hussein and the British commissioner in Egypt, McMahon. At the same time, the British were also talking to other European imperial powers. So the British played this game of deception, unfortunately, very well. They were also discussing with the French, in particular, how to divide this Arabian Peninsula or the future territories that they are going to claim from the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, which collapsed eventually at the end of the First World War. So the British were playing games with three different parties. They decided to divide the northern parts of Arabia. The French took some, the British took some in the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. At the same time, they were promising Sharif Hussein a kingdom all over Arabia, but at the same time, they were also talking to the Sauds in Najd and other parts of Arabia, and talking to the Zionist movement, which contributed to the war efforts of the British in the First World War. Eventually, on the 2nd of November in 1917, only 2 days after taking over Palestine from the Ottomans, the British issued an official document promising a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And it reads as His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, so they still acknowledge that this was called Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. It is very unfortunate that the Palestinians who existed in Palestine for more than 4,000 years, or if we start with Jericho, for more than 10,000 years, were seen by the British as only existing non-Jewish communities, while the Zionists of Europe, who can hardly claim any historical links or ethnic relations with the land of Palestine, were promised a homeland in Palestine. So Zionist and European imperialist conspiracy was at the prime time in the early 20th century, especially after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. The British took over Palestine and established rule over the Palestinian territories. It was, of course, officially acknowledged by the League of Nations as the British mandate over Palestine in 1922. But of course, following up on the developments in Gaza today and how the United Nations is incapable of doing anything to stop the genocide in Gaza. We understand how things worked for the British in the early 20th century with the League of Nations. They could get away with anything. They decided to take over Palestine, to promise it to the Jews, to officially run the affairs of the Palestinians, and to deny the Palestinians any right of self-governance or self-determination for 30 years, until eventually a Jewish community formed some power to take over Palestine. So for 30 years, from 1917 until 1947, the British patronship of a Jewish homeland in Palestine resulted in the takeover of Palestine. Who was the actor that actually implemented this Zionist Jewish dream in Palestine? It was, of course, the Jewish militias. Palestine was not taken over from the Palestinians through an argument or through a debate or through an intellectual discourse. It was taken over from the Palestinians through a British mandated and sponsored Zionist military offensive. So the British facilitated the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, starting with the Balfour Declaration, and of course through a lot of instruments, including the Zionist militias that were established in the early 20th century in Palestine. Many Jewish Zionist soldiers who served in the British Army turned into the root of a new Zionist army in Palestine. The participation of the Jewish militants in the Second World War efforts under the British Army also contributed a lot of fighters and organization and weapons to the Zionist militias. And these three Zionist militias stand out as the main perpetrators of the ethnic cleansing in Palestine that we will talk about in a short while. Haganah, the main military group in occupied Palestine throughout the British Mandate. Irgun and Lehi, two terrorist organizations that were proponents of a more right-wing version of Zionism. Irgun, for instance, if you look at its logo, dreams of a homeland for the Jewish people, not only in Palestine, but also in Jordan and other territories that encompass parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. In addition to the military organizations that took over Palestine, the British facilitated the flourishing of Zionist institutions in Palestine and internationally. One of these institutions was the Jewish Agency, which was formed in 1929 by Chaim Weizmann, who was the chairman of the World Zionist Organization and headquartered in Jerusalem. This Jewish Agency tried very hard to facilitate the migration of Zionist Jews from across the world in what was called the Return of Jews, or Aliyah program. The Jewish Agency, later on under David Ben-Gurion, made sure that more Jewish immigrants come to Palestine, take up arms, join Jewish institutions in the occupied Palestinian lands, and help in establishing Israel. Another important institution was the Jewish National Fund, which continues to exist and to own large territories in occupied Palestine. It was established in 1901 in the Fifth Zionist Congress in Switzerland, and it started to buy lands as much as possible, especially from noble aristocratic families which owned lands in Palestine but never dwelled there, like some Lebanese aristocratic families, which weren't very eager to keep lands that they weren't using. But the total purchases that the Jewish National Fund made was very, very minimal, and the absolute majority of the Palestinian land was still owned by the Palestinians or by the state, which was at that time the Ottoman state. Eventually, when the British took over, the government lands, which are the large swathes of land, were handed over to the British, or were taken over by the British. After the British, they were taken over by the new Jewish state that was established in Palestine. And the Jewish National Fund continues to manage many of these lands. This leads us to the partition plan. when the British controlled Palestine for 30 years, they were unable to actually establish a Jewish homeland without hurting and undermining the position of the Palestinians. And the Palestinians were very unhappy. They started talking to the British at first, demanding national rights in Palestine, demanding elections, demanding an elected representation, an elected government. The British denied the Palestinians any of these rights and forced them into an aggressive resistance action against the militant British occupation of Palestine. By the early years of the British mandate in Palestine, there were almost 100,000 British soldiers occupying this small territory called Palestine. They used violence and all sorts of brutal repression of the Palestinians to control the Palestinian population, the Arab, Muslim, and Christian population of Palestine, in order to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish land inside Palestine, or a Jewish state inside Palestine. The Palestinians resisted, starting with the 1920 brief uprising, 1929 major Al-Buraq uprising, or Al-Buraq revolution. Later on, with the military resistance of the 1930s, in 1935 under Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, a renowned Syrian scholar who was exiled by the French and who came to Palestine to settle in Haifa, and later on led the Palestinian resistance troops and was killed in Ya'bad in Jenin. But his group continued its operations for many years to come. And in fact, they were able to liberate several rural areas of Palestine, but the British used massive military force to destroy this revolution, killing thousands of Palestinians from the year 1936 to 1939. In the meanwhile, the majority of the Palestinian people staged one of the longest strikes in history, the 1936 strike that continued for many months. And the demand of the Palestinians was very simple: end Jewish Zionist migration to Palestine and hand over Palestinian rule to the Palestinians. The British were maneuvering, were trying to use Jewish Zionist troops and money in their favor, while at the same time keeping the Palestinians checked. The Palestinians continued to resist. More Jewish immigrants continued to come. The British eventually realized that they are unable to handle the situation, and they decided to leave Palestine and leave it to the Zionist militias and the Palestinian people to face off each other and settle the problem. But before doing that, they tried to get a solution at the newly formed United Nations. The United Nations, of course, was in no place and no position to decide that these people should get a state or these people should not get a state. The United Nations is supposed to be a body where different countries deliberate. But unfortunately, in 1947, the mostly North countries of the North, the mostly white European colonial countries, decided to deliberate on our future without consulting the Palestinians, decided to negotiate and debate on who gets Palestine. So eventually, a plan was devised to partition or to divide Palestine between the Palestinian inhabitants of Palestine, who continued to be more than 70% of the population by then, and the Zionist Jewish immigrants who came all the way from Europe and who were, of course, earlier persecuted by the different colonial European powers. So the Europeans were trying to actually solve their own problem at the expense of the Palestinians. They thought that they can, as we say in Arabic, hit two birds in one stone. They thought that they can get rid of the Jewish people from Europe so that they can solve the Jewish problem. And at the same time, they could have a lasting control over the Middle East by forming an external entity, not very natural to the region, but serving Western um, uh, interests and Western purposes. Of course, they thought partitioning Palestine would solve the problem, where they give the majority of the land to the Jewish immigrants and a smaller portion to the Palestinians, while Jerusalem remains as an international city for the United Nations to manage and run. The Arabs, the Palestinians, of course, logically rejected this plan. Some people come now acting smart some 70, 75 years later and say, oh, the Palestinians should have accepted what was offered to them back then. I tell these people, wherever they are from, let a foreign power come to your country, send some immigrants to armed with weapons and extremist racial racist ideology. Uh, Let them divide your country and accept their partition plan. Nobody will accept that. So back then in 1947, the Palestinians, although they were controlled by the British and weren't in a good negotiating position, they were in no place to accept a partition plan where an external colonial power comes and tells them, hey, you give 55% of your land to somebody else. And look at the land that was promised to the Israeli regime. They were promised the uh, good agricultural land here in the center and the north, the coastal area with Haifa port, the economic hub of Palestine, the whole desert with all of its resources and access to the Red Sea, the Tabariya lake. It was just illogical, rude, and insulting actually to the Palestinians to carry out such a plan. But anyway, the Palestinians rejected. Israeli militias had a different plan. We come now to the second phase of our discussion to discuss the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1947, 1948, what Palestinians call Nakba, what Israeli new historian Ilan Pappé calls the ethnic cleansing of Palestine after studying the documents of the Israeli militias, which later became the Israeli military, or what is called by its proponents the Israel Defense Force. These documents showed very clearly that carefully planned ethnic cleansing was conducted in 1947 at the hands of the Zionist militias, Haganah and others, under the leadership of war criminal David Ben Gurion, who later became the first prime minister of the new Zionist state, the State of Israel. The ethnic cleansing that took place in 1947-1948 ignored the partition map. They only took the political impact of the partition plan. They started to claim that the United Nations is telling us that we can have an independent state for the Jewish people. So they had the Balfour Declaration earlier from the British, and now they have this United Nations plan to divide Palestine and give the Zionist movement and the Jewish people a state in Palestine. They used this, but they ignored the map, and they continue until today to ignore any maps. Israel actually does not have an official border. That's why the right wing in Israel continues to propose Greater Israel from the Euphrates to the Nile. And if you see the maps proposed by extremist Israeli ministers like Smotrich or others, it actually encompasses many other territories besides historical Palestine, because the Zionist movement never wanted to have a fixed border for Israel. They relied a lot on power, and they thought that we can expand our territory as much as our troops can go. Anyway, they ignored the partition plan borders. They ignored the earlier division of Palestine, which was handled by the Ottomans and later by the British, and they eventually moved to establish their own state over larger territories of Palestine, encompassing some 78% of historical Palestine. What happened in 1947 and 1948? One good example is Deir Yassin. The Israeli Haganah militias had a plan called Plan Dalit, which explicitly designed how the Palestinians should be massacred and driven out of Palestine. So several big massacres like Deir Yassin, where over 250 Palestinians were executed in cold blood by the Zionist militias, took place, and eventually humanitarian corridors, as they call them now, were opened for the Palestinian villagers and Palestinian civilians to leave Palestine. So within the span of some 6 months, over 750,000 Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinian population back then, was driven out of Palestine. The expulsion of the Palestinian took place. The Palestinians overnight found themselves in refuge after more than 4,000 years of continuous existence in Palestine, and in fact, for many Palestinian communities, it's more than 4,000 years, maybe 10,000 years of existence in Palestine. A new colonial power has emerged in the name of Israel, and it decided that the Palestinians do not have the right to exist in their own homeland. They were exiled to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and elsewhere. These 750,000 Palestinians are now more than 6 million in numbers, and they continue to be refugees waiting for a chance to go back to their homeland. The perpetrators of this crime, on the other hand, the Zionist Jews, took over the properties of these Palestinian refugees. They stole their lands, they robbed their houses, they robbed their banks, their schools, their cinemas, and they established the state of Israel. Deir Yassin was just an example of the massacres that took place. If you want to understand what happened in 1948, look at what's happening now in Gaza. One difference, of course, is there. In 1947, 1948, the Palestinians were massacred and were driven out of their homeland. In 2023 and 2024, the Palestinians are being massacred continuously in larger numbers than probably even Nakba, but many of them continue to refuse to leave their homelands because they learned from the bitter experience of Nakba. In fact, 70% of the population of Gaza are actually refugees who were driven out of their homelands in 1947 and 1948. Anyway, within the span of 1 year, 500 Palestinian towns and cities were wiped out the map. Towns like Lid and Ramla were taken over by the Zionists. Cities like Yafa, Haifa, Nasra were taken over by the Zionists. Many Palestinians were displaced internally and externally, and a new regime was established through massacres and ethnic cleansing. The creation of Israel, of course, took more than 1 year. It was declared an independent state in May 1948. Unfortunately, the Palestinians were denied any means of resistance under the British rule, who ruled Palestine for 30 years. If a Palestinian had any weapon, they would have ended in jail, or worse, could have been executed. And there are many documented cases where Palestinian resistance fighters or even Palestinian villagers who had some weapons were executed by the British mandate authorities. The Palestinian political leadership was in exile. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was was the Mufti of Palestine and later the head of the Palestinian higher committees, the main political institution in Palestine, was exiled from Palestine. Palestinian resistance fighters were either under heavy British crackdown or were organizing themselves with the help of some Arab states, but were way outnumbered by the Zionist militias, who by the end of the war were more than 120,000 soldiers, while the Palestinians were a few thousand soldiers with no ammunition. And there are documents now showing how the Palestinian fighters of the 1940s were asking the Arab nations to arm them, but unfortunately arms never came. After Israel was declared an independent state in May 1948, several Arab armies came to intervene. It was too little, too late. Israel by then has controlled a lot of territories, has received some international recognition immediately from the American and Soviet Union states, and the Arab states that came to intervene were actually newly independent states with either no arms or no plans, or worse, with British military leadership. In the case of Jordan, for instance, the chief of the armed forces and most of his generals were actually British soldiers. So these people who handed over Palestine to the Zionist movement over a silver platter were actually supposed to save Palestine from the Zionist movement. So many of these Arab armies were unable to impact a change, although some of them, like the Iraqi army or even the Jordanian army, uh, tried very hard. The Egyptian army as well tried very hard in some territories, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. But again, they were too late and their efforts were too little. Palestine was lost to the Zionist movement. Jordan annexed the West Bank, Egypt annexed Gaza, and the new Israeli state destroyed Palestinian culture and life in the 78% uh, of Palestine that they got. Ben Gurion became the first prime minister of Israel. They established a Jewish only democratic state where the Palestinian citizens who remained inside the 78% of Palestine, about 150,000 Palestinians, were treated as second class citizens under military rule. And after Nakba, of course, Israel continued to expand its territory and its hegemony over its neighboring countries. Now, the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1948 was not brought to International Court of Justice or to International Criminal Court. The war criminals who perpetrated these massacres, like Ben Gurion, are still revered as heroes in Israel and are still respected in some, spheres of academia with colonial mindset. They're still seen as the heroes who liberated the Jewish people and established the Jewish state. But in reality, these were war criminals who committed heinous crimes, who killed children, men, and women, who conducted terrible massacres as documented in Ilan Pape's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, or as described in Radwa Ashur's novel The Woman of Tantura, or as described by many surviving Palestinian elderly men and women who continue to tell the stories of Nakba up until today. Many of these refugees are still alive, living in exile in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and elsewhere, but the atrocities committed by the Zionist militias are still not accounted for. Many of the secrets of 1947 and 1948 will be disclosed someday when the Zionist regime is dismantled and their archives are opened for research. After Israel emerged, and here we come to the final phase of our discussion, discussing the new Zionist state. After Nakba took place, Israel was not content with 78% of Palestine. Again, this is a racist ideology. Zionism is a racist ideology that inspired European colonizers to come and steal somebody else's land. And eventually it inspired them to kill innocents, to change names of places, to change history, to create a whole narrative. So a European blue-eyed immigrant becomes the descendant of Jacob, while a Palestinian whose ancestors lived for 10,000 years in Palestine becomes an outsider. Lies like a land without people to a people without land were spread all over the place. And Israel claimed to be the David that defeated Goliath, when in reality they were brutal colonizers who were supported by imperialist European powers to steal somebody else's land and to commit atrocities and to establish a new illegal regime in somebody else's land. the Nakba that took place paved the way for a monstrous regime to emerge. This new Frankenstein is the state of Israel. Let's talk about the state of Israel and what it has been doing to its neighbors. Ethnic cleansing, of course, of the Palestinian people continues as we speak, even in Gaza and the West Bank today. But Israel, throughout 75 years of its existence, could not live in peace with its neighbors. Even during the time it was trying to normalize relations with its neighbors and others, it actually was only interested in expanding its hegemony. So in 1956, the Israeli regime, the new Israeli regime, attacked Egypt. 1967, the new expansionist Zionist regime attacked Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, occupying Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the Egyptian Sinai and the Syrian Golan. 1973, it again clashed with its neighbors who tried to wrestle some of their territories but were unable to do so through military force. 1978, Israel attacked southern Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, occupying another Arab capital after Jerusalem, which is Beirut, and killing thousands of Palestinians and Lebanese, committing atrocities and besieging the city of Beirut for months. In later years, Israel re-invaded the West Bank in 2002. It killed several Palestinians and eventually led to the demise of the Palestinian leader and President Yasser Arafat in 2004. In 2006, it attacked Lebanon, committing atrocities and massacres, destroying parts of the Lebanese capital through aerial strikes like the ones we see in Gaza now. In 2008 and 9, it committed more war crimes in its attacks on Gaza. 2012, 2014, 2021, it committed many war crimes and massacres in Gaza through its repetitive attacks and military invasions. But in 2023 and 2024, we see an ongoing genocide of huge proportions that even the International Court of Justice is going to examine and study for the first time in many decades. So there is a case now proposed by South Africa at the International Court of Justice that will decide if Israel is committing the crime of genocide or not. But anybody who spends a few minutes on social media, which is still censored by Zionist companies, anybody who spends a few minutes watching the videos coming out of Gaza knows that what's going on is a terrible genocide. So the state of Israel declared its independence and did not form or write a constitution because it was, it was comprising of so many rivaling and competing ideologies. They are all Zionist, but there are extremist right-wing ones with revisionist Zionist ideology who want to expand further and who want this and that social program. There were also religious ones, there were secular ones, there were left-wing ones, there were, interestingly, even communist Zionists who all differed in their own ideologies. So the solution to avoid an early collapse of the Zionist state was not to write a constitution at all. They have only basic laws. Israel has several basic laws, including, for instance, the very recent infamous nation-state law, which downgraded the level of the Arabic language and which practically turned Israel into an official apartheid regime. So over the years, Israel has been run by these basic laws, and it has an executive branch of government led by a president and a prime minister. The president has ceremonial powers, but the president has the president has ceremonial power, and the prime minister has executive powers. The current prime minister is none but war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the longest serving Israeli prime minister, who has been in power for 3 times. He is from the right-wing party Likud, which we will be highlighting in a few more minutes. The legislature of Israel is the Knesset. It's a unicameral system where they have 120 seats of their own parliament. These members of the Knesset represent the different Israeli political groups and parties. And although the absolute majority are Jewish Zionists, in recent years, in recent decades, Arabs or Palestinian Israelis started to participate in these elections and have a small representation in this Israeli parliament. There are different rivaling ideologies in the Israeli political arena, starting with the left wing, the earliest party, the Mapai party, which ran Israel in the early days, led by David Ben-Gurion, later turned into the Labour Party since 1968 all the way until now. But the Labour Party, which ran Israel for several years, is now a small political force on the left side of the political spectrum, with very few members of Knesset or parliament. The Likud party, which is formed upon a revisionist right-wing Zionist ideology, is now the dominant political force in Israel. It's led by Benjamin Netanyahu, whose father was the assistant of an early Zionist ideologue in the name of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Ze'ev Jabotinsky is the father of the revisionist Zionist movement, an extremist form of Zionism, which tries to advance a right-wing version of Zionism. Likud is still in power now. There are other political groups like Blue and White Camp, which is led by a former military general, Benny Gantz. There are extinct parties like Kadima, which was a political force formed by Ariel Sharon, a former Likud leader, later led by Ehud Olmert and others, but eventually the party disappeared. Israel's political institutions are very fluid, so the political parties are easily disbanded and recreated, but the ideologies remain. There is a clear left-wing Zionist ideology. There is a clear right-wing Zionist ideology with two branches: religious or secular right-wing, and either nationalist right-wing or nationalist religious right-wing. There are parties, for instance, on the secular right, like Yisrael Beitenu, run by Russian Jews, mainly Russian Jews, like Avigdor Lieberman. There are religious parties. Orthodox Zionist Party, Shas, for instance, is one of the largest ones. There is United Torah Judaism, and there are many new religious parties, like the ones run by Ben-Gvir, an Iraqi Jew, or by Smotrich, a Ukrainian Jew, who all agree on extremist religious right-wing version of Zionism. Almost all Israeli political parties are Zionist, except the Palestinian political parties in Israel, which are a small minority that tries to represent the Palestinians politically. This include, for instance, the formerly known Arab United List, or Al-Qa'im al-Mushtaraka. There are also Islamic parties within the context of the Arab political parties in Israel. But all these political groups have very little power to impact on the Israeli political system. Their main struggle, of course, is to protect some of the political and basic rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are about 1.5 million Palestinians still living under direct Israeli rule in the historical lands of Palestine. These are people who were not forced out in 1948 because they either resisted or they were internally displaced, and they continued to live inside Palestine. In 1966, Israel granted them citizenship and reformed some of its laws and allowed them into the political system in order to look democratic, but In reality, they are second-class citizens who cannot live anywhere they wish, who cannot participate in certain institutions, and who are persecuted within Israel itself, and their basic rights of language and political aspirations are repressed. The Israeli military is called by the Israelis as the Israel Defense Force. It's one of the most brutal military forces in modern history. They have killed more children than any other military in the world. In fact, the ongoing genocide in Gaza has proven that the so called Israel Defense Force is by now the most horrible military force in modern history. They have killed more than 110 journalists in Gaza in only 3 months. They have butchered and killed more than 10,000 Palestinian children. In the war in Ukraine, for instance, between the Russians and the Ukrainians, less than 1,000 children have been killed in 2 years of fighting. In Gaza, the so-called Israeli Defense Force has killed more than 10,000 children, and you can see many of the footage and the videos online in less than 3 months. The Israeli Defense Force has a ground force that has been trying hard to reoccupy Gaza, but for 3 months they have been unable to make any serious gain. They rely more on their brutal air force, which has a huge fleet of American fighter jets, F-35s, and Apaches, and many other high-tech fighter jets, which can burn houses, neighborhoods, and drop 1 ton, 2 ton bombs on civilians in the blink of an eye. Israel relies a lot on this air force. If they don't have this air force, I think history would have been very different. And they have, of course, a naval force, which, for instance, committed some war crimes in 2010 by attacking the Freedom Flotilla that was sending humanitarian aid to Gaza in May 2010. In addition to a lot of intelligence bodies which use all means to advance Israel's occupation and apartheid. One of the main contributing factors to Israel's military might is, of course, American aid. Ever since the United States recognized Israel and became the patron of Israel, it contributed huge, significant aid to the Israeli military and the Israeli regime. In fact, I can argue that without American military and economic aid to Israel, history would have been very different. Israel is the largest receiver of unconditional American military aid. For instance, since 2016, they have been receiving $3.8 billion of military aid annually, in addition, of course, to other amounts spent on research and development, as well as economic investments, economic assistance, and so-called philanthropic contributions to the Zionist regime. So without American aid, Israel would have emerged probably as a normal state. But this huge American military and economic aid has made Israel the Frankenstein that it is today. It's a small state with huge military. The whole society is militarized. Everybody serves in the army, men and women. The amount of military spending is huge. Israel has military bases, if you look at the map, all over occupied Palestine. It, in fact, to many, acts as a forward American military base in the Middle East, advancing American hegemony in the Middle East. But of course, there are many questions about the real significance of Israel's military power to America and the morality, of course, of such support because of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the efforts of civil society in the United States. Many are now questioning America's unconditional military aid to Israel. Some try to explain it academically. For instance, John Mearsheimer, and Stephen Walt, have published an important work in the name of okay, in the name of the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, trying to explain this uniqueness of the case of Israel. Why is the Israeli regime so influential over the United States politics and is able to get away with anything and is able to get this much money and weapons? So this military alliance explains actually a lot of the ongoing brutalities. Without such military aid and so much political cover and support, Israel would have been unable to do many of the atrocities that it is committing. Anyway, this military aid continues, and interestingly, the contributions of Zionist Jewish supporters of Israel on the civil society level are also huge and run to the billions of dollars, unlike, for instance, the contributions of the whole Muslim world to the Palestinian struggle. Although, of course, many individuals contribute, but if you try to do a simple calculation of what the Zionist movement is doing on the civil society level, raising funds and helping Israel, and compare it with what the whole world, including the Muslim world, is doing to contribute to the Palestinian struggle, you will be shocked to see the stark difference in the contributions. But anyway, Israel continues to use all this military might and resources to expand its territories, to expand its hegemony. By now, in 2024, this is the proposed plan for a future Palestinian state, as the American administration of Trump proposed once in 2020 through the so-called deal of the century. But if you look back at this second last map, the Palestinian territories are basically practically under direct military rule since the attacks on Gaza took place in October. Until now, the Israeli military is basically and practically everywhere over the Palestinian land. I hope I have highlighted throughout the past 1 hour what Zionism is, what is it about, the massacres and ethnic cleansing it committed in Palestine in 1947-1948, and the ongoing atrocities committed by the Zionist state inside Palestine and in the neighboring countries. I open the floor for questions, and I hope we will have some comments as well from the friends who are watching this discussion. Okay, I start with Munira Aminullah. Assalamu alaikum. You said earlier that there are Muslim or Arab Zionists. I wonder, why are they attracted to this ideology? I think not all practical Zionists are attracted to Zionism. Yes, there are religious Zionists, for instance, evangelical Zionists, who are advancing one version of messianic ideology. They want the Messiah to return to Palestine by grouping all the Jewish people of the world in Palestine and eventually either killing them or converting them to Christianity. So these Christian Zionists are out there for an ideology and a belief, but not all Zionists support Israel because of a belief. Many support Israel because of money, because of fear, because of the influence of the Zionist lobby I've just highlighted. You see, this thick book shows that the Zionist regime has used all means to control people, not just to win hearts and minds. It wasn't only about winning hearts and minds. It was actually and usually about brainwashing or controlling influential figures to establish their own regime and hegemony. So yeah, Why do some Arab and Muslim people support Zionism? I don't think it's out of love. Maybe there are some, uh, you know, people who have rented their minds, but I think the absolute majority is out of fear and control, or out of intellectual defeat. Okay, what's the summary of John Mersheimer's article on the US funding to Israel? He says that Israel has used this lobby, the IPAC and other Jewish lobbies in the United States, to control American decision making and foreign policy making through money and other forms of influence, and that the American state aligning with Israel no matter what is actually a big mistake, because that is morally questionable, and that is not really serving the interests of the American state. For example, look at what America is doing now in Gaza. It's sponsoring the genocide. Try to do a poll anywhere in the Muslim world or anywhere in Asia or Africa. Do you think the American nation, the American government, and the American people are becoming more beloved to the hearts of the people of Asia and Africa, or the opposite? It certainly is the opposite. So aligning with Israel, no matter what, is costing America a lot, is actually hurting and undermining American interests. This is some of the ideas that Prof. Mersheimer discusses. He has just published a very brief and important article on the genocide in Gaza. Please try to Google it. I'll try to also share it in our WhatsApp group for discussion. Are Ashkenazi and Khazar Jews the same or different? This is Fatima Khan. I think Ashkenazi Jews are these European Jews. Now, of course, most of them are Khazar Jews, who are Khazar tribes that converted to Judaism and continue to share some cultural elements with the Khazar, people, and who also continue to share the same ethnic links. So you can in a way say it's more or less the same. Anna Khan, Assalamu alaikum, sir. Where are the Arab Palestinian Jews in the political system? Okay, there are no Arab Palestinian Jews. They are Arab Palestinian Israelis, because they hold Israeli citizenships and Israeli identity cards, but they are not Jews, of course. Arab Palestinians are either Muslim or Christians. There are very, very few Arab Palestinian Jews. For instance, the Samaritan Jews of Nablus, they identify as Palestinian only, and they refuse to identify as Israeli. They don't support Zionism, but this is a very small community. Don't the Arab Palestinian Jews have a political party? The Jewish people who were in Palestine before the start of Zionist migration in 1882 are very, very, very few. And most of them have lost their identity and merged with the other Zionist Jews. But I'm very sure that there are some of them there, and it deserves some academic research and attention. What do you mean by lobby? Where is Israel, Rahim Ahmad? Where is Israel getting funds to form a lobby in the USA? USA is a democratic country, or it likes to be described as a democratic country. In democracies, you can have your own NGOs and other institutions. You see, in a liberal democracy, you're supposed to have the state, the market, and the society. In the society, you can have NGOs, you can have universities, you can have academic institutions, you can have lobby groups, etc. So in America, in the case of America, the Zionist lobbies are very powerful. They are way more powerful than they are supposed to be. I mean, others have lobbies in the US. There is an Iranian lobby, there is an Armenian lobby, there's probably a Turkish lobby, there is a Muslim lobby, and Muslim lobby groups. But the most influential and powerful one is the Zionist lobby, because it uses all means. For instance, there were claims by some anti-Israel Congress members in the US that Israel is paying rivals up to $20 million just to run against this pro-Palestine or this Palestinian Congress woman or congressman. So you see the influence that this lobby has. Zionism was coined, okay, going on to Fatima Khan. The Zionism was coined much before Herzl. Is that so? Now, it's about the same time of Herzl. The term Zionism, the word Zionism, according to some references, was coined by Nathan Birnbaum, who was also an Austrian activist and journalist. He published several works, including his own journal, and he later on turned against political Zionism. In his early years, he actually adopted the idea of Zionism, and he coined the term Zionism and Zionist and political Zionism, of course, using the name of Mount Zion in Jerusalem. There were other groups described together as lovers of Zion, for instance, many Russian Jewish groups that emerged as a response to the anti-Jewish pogroms that were taking place, the massacres and persecution of the Jews. But Herzl was the political figure who, in Arabic, as a figure of speech, I would say, who gave legs to this idea. So suddenly, this ideology had legs to walk. I'll give some example, which of course is different, but just to make it easier to understand. The ideas of political Islam existed before Hassan al-Banna. There was this Jamal Din al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, reformist Islamic leaders. But Hassan al-Banna, as a political intellectual figure, created a political outfit called the Muslim Brotherhood, which epitomized political Islam in the early 20th century. In probably the same way, Theodor Herzl wasn't the one who created so-called Jewish emancipation and Jewish nationalism and Zionism, but he was the one who pushed it forward through organizing Zionist conferences and establishing the World Zionist Organization, and eventually, and of course, through publishing the Jewish State Book, and eventually through diplomatic efforts with different European powers. Okay. Maryam Zakiya, do all the political parties, either left wing or right wing, have the same spectrum of Zionism? Any difference among the young people? Maybe more liberal minded, or no hope at all from within? Okay, Maryam. There is left wing Zionism, there is right wing Zionism, there is center Zionism, but they are all Zionists. And Zionism is a racist ideology. It's like having left wing Nazism, right wing Nazism, center Nazism. It's still Nazism. Zionism is a racist idea that Palestine belongs to people who migrated all the way from Europe because of some ancient historical claims, and that there are no Palestinians. If there are Palestinians, when they face Palestinians, they face an intellectual and moral dilemma. Oh, there are Palestinians. What should we do about them? So Ben Gurion and the early Zionists thought, okay, just kill them, get rid of them, or force them out. But now, 75 years later, the Zionist movement, left, right, and center, realized that the Palestinians are there to stay. It's hard to, imagine that they will disappear. So instead of accepting the Palestinians as a reality and giving them something, for instance, a state or coexistence, the majority of the Zionist movements, left, right, and center, are thinking of another ethnic cleansing, genocide. You look at the interviews with Israeli journalists, politicians, members of parliament, and ministers. Some of them suggest nuking Gaza. Some of them suggesting flattening Gaza. Some of them suggesting, and Netanyahu is working hard on achieving that, they suggest bringing these 2 million Palestinians who live in Gaza as refugees to other countries. Just send them here and there, and the problem solved. And in fact, the Americans, Blinken, a Jewish Zionist American leader, tried very hard to promote this idea and sell it to Arab countries in the early days of the war, but none of the Arab countries was interested in this crazy proposal. So yeah, if you are a Zionist, you are a racist by definition. There are post-Zionists. those who try to make adjustments, say Zionism is bad, let's try to reform. But they are a very small minority in Israel. There are those who abandon Zionism, anti-Zionists, for instance. Some of them leave Israel, scholars like Ilan Pape, or some Orthodox groups in Europe and the United States. So not all Jewish people are actually Zionists. There are anti-Zionist Jews, religious and secular. But as long as you are an Israeli Jewish, you are most probably a Zionist. And if you organize politically and join any of the members, any of the political parties in the Knesset, except the Arab parties, you are eventually a Zionist who is either left, right, or center Zionist. Any difference between the young people and the older people? The younger generation is more brainwashed and more extremist. That's why we see newer versions of right-wing Zionism emerging. We see Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who 20 years ago were considered to be terrorist extremists in Israel itself. Today, these people are ministers, and their political groups are growing, and they are becoming more popular. You just see the videos on TikTok, how Israeli youngsters are reacting to the massacres in Gaza, making fun of the famine that is taking place. Writing their names and names of other people on missiles that are going to hit Gaza. The society is just is in a mess. I think they need a big shock to end their investment in extremist Zionism. Maybe something like what happened to Nazi Germany when Nazism was defeated, and then a lot of rehabilitation took place. Okay. Hoping from within? No, I don't hope from within. There is no hope that Israel will change from within, except, of course, through Palestinian resistance and international pressure. But the Israeli people waking up one good morning and deciding to become, kind to their Palestinian neighbors, I don't see that happening, because they are privileged. They are heavily, brainwashed by Zionism. Okay, Rahim Ahmad, what is the best thing that people living in the United States can do for Palestine, for their liberation, and for now the ceasefire? Of course, for now ceasefire. We want a ceasefire to end this genocide. So the only power that actually can compel Israel to do something is the United States. I've just highlighted how much money they spend, how much weapons they give Israel. So the American president has the absolute power to stop any Israeli policy, and it has happened in past decades. So Biden is in the best position to stop the ongoing genocide. But Biden himself is a Zionist by definition. He defines himself to be a Zionist, and he is heavily, involved in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, providing ammunition, providing lies. He is the one who spread all the 40 babies lie, this lie and that lie. So what the American people can do is to stop the genocide. Pressure your president, pressure your congressmen and women, pressure your political establishment. And it's a democracy. You can demonstrate, you can do what many Jewish groups are doing in the United States, who are anti-Zionist Jews. They are protesting in train stations, in front of the White House, in their own counties and states. This should continue to take shape. But trust me, your democracy is not a full democracy. You can have 500,000 people or 1 million people marching in Washington, but still see the American president and congressmen and congresswomen sponsoring genocide in Gaza, because your democracy has serious problems. The lobby is more powerful than the voters. After this ongoing war in Gaza, of course, changing public opinion in the United States is a priority. It's happening. What can the change in international public opinion do? It can do a lot. Israel was created by the European imperialist powers to a large extent because of the feeling of guilt they had. There was this so-called moral responsibility of these European powers to actually give the Jewish people something. So they killed the Palestinians and kicked them out to help the Jewish people establish a state for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now, with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, many people realize that these Jewish Israelis have actually become monsters, worse than the Nazis who persecuted their ancestors. So the public opinion is shifting. We have to contribute to speeding up the shift in public opinion so that the American public opinion stops any American military aid to Israel, or questions the morality and the practicality and the interest in continuing to support Israeli apartheid and genocide. Anna Khan is asking, is Israel a tool for Illuminati Freemasonry? Now, this will require some research, but I would say that Freemasonry is a movement that has existed for probably centuries. Does it have links with Zionism and Judaism? It probably does. More research should be done on this, but I'm not an expert on this subject. Zah K. Ilan Pape, Prof. Ilan Pape, the Jewish historian, said he sees the end of Israel. Colonel MacGregor, ex-US Defense Strategic Advisor and decorated Marine, said the same. Your thoughts? I'm not only certain that the end of Israel will come. I, as a Palestinian, and you, as a supporter of Palestine, should work very hard to actually speed up the end of Israel. Israel, as a regime, is a fascist, apartheid, colonial regime. It should be dismantled. There is no way for world peace and stability in the Middle East with this monstrous regime continuing to commit genocide and war crimes. The only way out is actually to dismantle this extremist regime. And this is what Amnesty International is calling for. This is what Human Rights Watch is calling for. This is what Israeli human rights group B'Tselem is calling for. This is what almost all the Palestinians are calling for. This is what BDS is calling for. We are calling for an end to apartheid, end to genocide, end to war crimes, end to colonialism, and that necessarily means, an end to Israel as we know it. Zah K. Probably Palestine can be saved if the IDF, the Israeli occupation forces, is defeated. That's one way of freeing Palestine, of course. Only through military might, that's one way. And I think history is beautiful. History has many answers to many of our questions. Let's look at Yugoslavia, for instance. Yugoslavia, those who were born in the 70s or 80s, knew Yugoslavia as a country, probably a powerful country. Where is Yugoslavia now? It disintegrated, it disappeared. Soviet Union, in my lifetime, in many of your lifetimes, it was there. It's not there anymore. Apartheid South Africa, those of you who remember, was an apartheid regime, a product of the colonial era. The regime has changed. The same, I think, will happen to Israel, whether through military might or through disintegration or through economic problems or through Palestinian resistance from within. This will happen eventually. But we have to work very hard to achieve that. Of course, the Palestinians are sacrificing their blood to achieve that. We need the whole world to be on our side to achieve that. Now, there are other scenarios, of course. If you are going to explore all the logical scenarios, there is the North American scenario or the Australian scenario where the original inhabitants were just wiped out. How many Red Indians do you see in North America now? How many Aborigines do you see in Australia now? A few of them, very, very few of them. They have been wiped out of the map. So this scenario is there. Israel killing 3-4 million Palestinians, kicking out the rest, maintaining maybe a few hundred thousands. That scenario is there, but we will not allow it to happen. The free people of the world will not allow this scenario to happen. The scenario that we would like to see is a scenario where apartheid is dismantled, colonialism comes to an end, Palestine is free, Israel's occupation comes to an end. We would like to see that, and we have to work very hard to achieve that. Okay, so these were some of the questions in tonight's discussion. I know that the topics we discussed are very, intense. They require a lot of reading. There are many books and works that help the beginners. I would suggest, for instance, the book that I have just touched on, The Israel Lobby. It's not directly related to the establishment of Israel, but it helps understand how Israel gets away with everything. There is this good book, for instance, by Tariq Swedan. You can find the English version. The Jewish People, an encyclopedia. I think I saw this book once in Kinokuniya in Malaysia. There's an English version of it, Tariq Swedan. There are many other books about the Zionist narrative. For instance, this interesting book by Norman Finkelstein, Beyond Chutzpah, about how the Zionist movement has been using anti-Semitism and distorting history. There are books by Shlomo Sand about the creation of the Jewish people, or the invention of the Jewish people. There is a book by Ilan Pappé, actually many good books by Ilan Pappé. I mentioned one of them, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. There is a good novel that will help you understand what happened in 1948 if you have access to the English version, by Egyptian novelist Radwa Ashur. The title is The Woman from Tantura. In Arabic, it's called At-Tanturiya. Radwa is the mother of a renowned Palestinian poet, Tamim Barghouthi, and wife of the late renowned Palestinian novelist and poet as well, Murid al-Barghouthi, who wrote Have You Seen Ramallah? I think a novel called Have You Seen Ramallah? There is a lot of Palestinian literature which can help a lot. There is now a lot of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial Jewish literature coming out. You can have a look at it. Starting with the Prof. Ilan Pappé's books will be good. But there are also good introductory books to the system in Israel now, like Ben White's books. British journalist Ben White has written, for instance, Israeli Apartheid and Palestinians in Israel, and some other books. You can also have a look at these books. And please stay tuned with us to next week's lecture, where we will discuss the Palestinian struggle from a Palestinian angle. We will look at the Palestinian national resistance, Palestinian resistance factions, Palestinian political ideologies and parties, as well as the Palestinian political system in which the Palestinian public political life is taking shape. I hope that this discussion was useful, and I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions, whether in the WhatsApp group or through social media. And I thank Mustafa in the operations room of the Hashim Sani Center for his efforts and help in facilitating this lecture. And until we meet next week, Assalamu alaikum. Our prayers for our people in Gaza to have a safe night, and to see this ongoing genocide come to an end soon, inshallah. Thank you.